A very warm welcome to all of you. In today's class, we will look at the various units of analysis in migration research and specifically focus on the concept of methodological nationalism. So, the main idea is this, that when we look at migration, when we study migration, when we examine the various facets of migration, what our unit of analysis is really important, because your unit of analysis could be individual, it could be household, it could be community, it could be the nation state. So, the unit of analysis that you choose to study or the unit of analysis that is being studied has implications for outcomes. It also has implications for what is being studied and how policy is formed and so on and so forth. So, we will break this down a bit. We will therefore spend some time talking about the various units of analysis in migration research, and this is also obviously related to social research. And the second thing that we'll do is we look at the concept of methodological nationalism. Methodological nationalism is really important, particularly in the context of migration studies. And I'll take you through a seminal paper by Andrea Weber and Nina Gellerschlick for this. And while we discuss methodological nationalism, we will also speak a little bit about methodological individualism. Right. So, there are many ways of looking at the units of analysis in social sciences. We can look at micro units, macro units and meso units. So, a micro unit is something which is typically small. So, the individual, the household, these are typically understood as micro units, right? So, therefore, certain disciplines lean towards the understanding of microdata. So, if you look at microeconomics and microeconomics, you're largely looking at individual behavior, household behavior and so on, right? And then you have a macro unit. A macro unit might be something like the larger economy, the nation state, countries and so on. And so you have micro at the bottom and macro which is at the top, and then you have meso units in the middle, right? So, a meso unit could be that of a particular community, it could be that of a particular social group, a village, so something that's in between the micro and macro. So, and generally a meso level analysis indicates population size that falls between micro and macro levels, such as a community, such as an organization. And meso analysis is also very helpful in understanding the links between the micro and macro. And like I mentioned, the unit of analysis becomes especially important in social research. So, you could be looking at the individual as a specific unit of analysis, you could be looking at the family of the household, and you could be looking at the community or the nation state, right? And each unit that you look at has its own strengths and limitations when it comes to the scope of data, the scope of its analysis, right? So, for instance, if you're looking at only individual related migration and you're focusing only on the individual variable without looking at household or community level variables, then your story of migration may remain incomplete. Because say if we're looking at the determinants of migration, why people migrate, no doubt individual factors are important, but we also know empirically that individual factors are rested in household and community level factors. So, therefore, in our research design, we must be able to accommodate the various units of analysis. Otherwise, depending of course upon our research question. Otherwise, there is a danger that you may not be able to study the full picture if you don't look at the various units of analysis. Then very often you might have a situation where the results that you're getting at various units of analysis diverge with one another, right? So, therefore, even if you're looking at something as simple as the motivations to migrate or why someone migrates, you might find that individual motivations might be very different from family motivation, right? And similarly, when you're looking at community level variables. And in community level variables, social networks are really important, right? So you might have a situation where an individual is not keen to migrate, but because there's a culture of migration, because there are social networks that exist, there is some kind of pressure to migrate, right? So here the individual motivations are in tension with social networks and even cultural norms if there is a culture of migration, right? Now let me talk a little bit about the nation state. So now nation states are very ambivalent, especially in the context of our country. So if we had to understand international migration, what is the view of what is the perspective of the state on international migration? It's not very clear. It's not very clear. Again, the perspective of the state on international migration is also ambivalent. But it's important that we take into account the perspectives of all the units of analysis. So that's one part. For any research on migration, we need to understand, of course, some research projects would zoom in on a particular level of analysis, and that is natural. You can't do everything. But we must understand the strengths and limitations of each unit of analysis. And it is in this context that I want to talk a little bit about methodological individualism and methodological nationalism. Now, methodological individualism is when we privilege the individual in our method of social research, right? So, and this is fairly common practice. In this course, you see that in the discipline of economics, man is a rational actor, and largely individual orientations are given a lot of importance. So, whenever we zoom in to the individual and the individual gets a lot of importance and the focus is on the individual, very often then at the cost of other units of analysis, that's known as methodological individualism. Similarly, you have the concept of methodological nationalism at the other extreme, where the nation state and nationalism is amplified as a unit of analysis. And this is also really important, the context. I think in contemporary times, the context of this is very important, right? Because in general, on the one hand, so there's a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, we have a situation where we have processes of globalization, and there seems to be, there is seemingly a decline of the nation state. But on the other hand, national boundaries are becoming rigid, even boundaries within states are becoming rigid. And methodological nationalism has become a very, very important kind of analytical point of our times. So we will focus on methodological nationalism a little more as we go along. But before that, I want to talk to you a little bit about data and methodology. So, so we saw how there are various units of analysis in the previous slide, micro, macro, and meso. You can also look at units of analysis vis-a-vis the individual, the household or family, the community, and the nation state. And what unit of analysis that you study or examine or focus on so has a bearing on the data that you're using and the methods that you use. So if we were to look at it in a disciplinary manner, demographic studies or population studies largely do theorizing with large data sets. Right? So, this could be the census, this could be large sample surveys, and so if you're a demographer, if you're in the field of population studies, it's very likely that you will be working with large data sets. Having said that, therefore, we also need to be aware of the limitations of public survey data, like the one that we're talking about. So, in the US Census, there is an undernumeration of undocumented migrants, right? So therefore, if your topic of analysis is undocumented migration, then it's unlikely that you will rely too much because census data under-enumerates undocumented migrants. Similarly, in the Indian case, as we see in this course, there is an underestimation of short-term and seasonal migrants in the NSS data. So by survey design, NSS data is unable to capture short-term and seasonal migration because of concepts and definitions used in the survey. So again, there is an underestimation. So we need to then be aware of the limitations of large-scale public data sets that we work with. Then, if there are limitations of such data sets, we can also collect our own data. In fact, sociologists, economists, geographers, anthropologists, they all collect their own data on migration. But they have very different methods. So, economists are largely going to collect survey data, whereas sociologists, depending on their orientation, may have quantitative data or qualitative data. Anthropologists largely are going to be collecting ethnographic data, and whereas again in geography, depending on what methods you're using, that's going to inform data collection in a big way. So, so in research then, as you know, we have quantitative data, which is largely coming from large-scale data sets. You also have qualitative data and ethnographic data, which is a completely different way of doing research, a different way of collecting data. So therefore, what methods you use are largely a function of what discipline you're coming from. But having said that, there are also disciplines which use mixed methods in research and to make their research designs more broad. Now, what about political science? Political science, law, political economy, all of these areas largely require careful reading of text. So you will be doing document analysis here. You will be looking at text carefully. You could be doing discourse analysis. Then in history, historians largely use archival methods, or if they're collecting primary data, they use oral histories. And so historians can also be looking at population records, population registers, passport registers, land records, tax records, court documentation, if you're looking at the intersection of law and history. And now, historical studies can be of many kinds. Some historical studies avoid comparison. They look at the evolution of just one stream of migration and they tend to avoid comparison. Other historical studies might be comparative between migrant and non-migrant. And largely, if one is doing comparative work, then various sources of data, other sources of data, such as secondary sources, they help in the analysis. In anthropology, again, ethnographers largely work at a particular site and they work vis-a-vis other ethnographers. So their work is largely impressionist. They're not seeking out to do systematic comparisons. And but whenever there is comparative work done, largely anthropologists do longitudinal work, which is they compare work currently with their previous work. And then this allows them to do some kind of mid-range theorizing. We now come to the concept of methodological nationalism. Like I said, this is largely taken from Wimmer and Glickschiller's seminal paper. And Wimmer and Glickschiller define methodological nationalism as the assumption that the nation-state society is the natural order and political form in the modern world. And so you see the nation-state as a unit of analysis is something that they're emphasizing on. And I want you to think about when we do this, so in their paper, they discuss the evolution of how is it that methodological nationalism came to be, what is its implication in migration studies per se. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to the paper, introduce you to some key concepts as discussed by Wimmer and Glickschiller, right? So what they're really arguing is that the epistemic structures and programs of mainstream social sciences have been closely attached to and shaped by the experience of modern nation-state formation, right? And so therefore, methodological nationalism is very important in social science thinking, especially in post-war social science thinking. And in the context of globalization, they argue that the nation state is not in decline, but there are ways in which they are being refigured rather than being demolished. And so therefore, in this context, they argue that how nation states are built, nation building processes have been fundamentally shaped by the way immigration has been perceived and by the way immigration has been received. And these perceptions then about migrants and perceptions about migration and immigration, these perceptions in turn influenced social science theory, methodology, and more specifically the discourses on immigration and integration. And so then they go on to argue that methodological nationalism inhibits the true understanding of the nature of the modernization process. And why is that? This is because firstly, it's produced a systematic blindness towards the paradox that modernization has led to the creation of national communities amidst modern societies supposedly dominated by the principles of achievement. And the second part is that it's ignoring the national framing of modernity, however, is not just one form of methodological nationalism. So a second part to this is that, of course, like the one we discussed first, ignoring the national framing of modernity is not the only form of nationalism. A second variant is typically from more empirically oriented social science practices is taking national discourses, agendas, loyalties and histories for granted without problematizing them or making them an object of analysis in their own right. And so therefore, instead, nationally bounded societies are taken to be naturally given entities to study. So if you look at economics as a discipline, from the time of Adam Smith, Adam Smith wrote an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. It was published in 1789. And there's been a distinction between the internal economy and external relations. And this has really become a guiding principle for the evolution of economics as a discipline. And Adam Smith made it very clear in the introduction in his three-part volume, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, that he was about to explain the employment of labor, the employment of capital in more or less civilized nations. So you see, the nation state is important. The nation is important here. And so and this followed suit from the time of Adam Smith. You go to John Maynard Keynes, you go to contemporary time now, where anything, you want to understand development, you want to understand processes of change, you want to understand poverty, we're always looking at national indicators, the per capita income of a country. So what this does is it also obfuscates certain real issues. So for instance, if you're looking at poverty and you're looking at specific countries, okay, the country is important. You need to know what percentage of the poverty, what percentage of the poor are below the poverty line. So Wimmer and Glickschiller also talk about the process of naturalization. The naturalization of methodological nationalism. How is it that methodological nationalism becomes such a natural phenomenon, right? So the naturalization of the nation state and different disciplines and academic institutions, and they say that, and they show that it's very hard to do comparative cross-country research, even more so in migration studies, and that's largely because how social science is organized, how it's organized through national institutions and so on. They also discuss the concept of territorialization, and so they argue that the social sciences have become obsessed with describing processes within nation-state boundaries as contrasted with those outside. And that's what I was trying to say with the case of poverty. So when we study something like poverty, what you have is that, we're always looking at it as the percentage of poverty in a country, or and whereas if another way of studying could be to look at the poor across countries, and the poor may be far more aligned across countries than with other classes in their own country, right? And so what Wimmer and Glickschiller argue is that because we are so obsessed with national boundaries that we have lost sight of connections between such nationally defined territories. And so they invoke Giddens, and they say that the web of social life was spun within the container of national society, and everything extending over its border is cut off analytically, right? And when we come to post-World War II, when we come to, that's another time where nationalism and the nation state went hand in hand. So typically in the context, in the post-war context, you had democracy, citizenship, social security, and national self-determination. These are the four vertexes of the world order post-World War II, right? Wimmer and Glickschiller argue that it's easy to see the parallels within the container model of society that had developed in the social sciences and became dominant after the Second World War. And they say the translation is almost one-to-one. The citizenry is mirrored in the concept of a national legal system, the sovereign in the political system, the nation in the cultural system, and the solitary group in the social system, all boundaries being congruent and together defining the skin, holding together the body of the society. So what they're saying is that the nation state and nationalism went hand in hand in the post-war society, and then this in turn has implications for immigration and migrants, to which we now come. So what they're saying is that it should be clear why, for both nation builders as well as post-war social scientists, that migration became such an acute area of inquiry, became such a special area of inquiry. So the first is they say that in the nationalist doctrine, as well as according to the container society, immigrants must appear as antinomies to the orderly working of the state and society. Even in societies where past immigration constitutes the foundation myth of the nation, even in those societies, it's important to look at this. And Wimmer and Glickschiller see four reasons why migrants become a special object of policy making as well as of a specialized body of research. The first thing they say is that migrants destroy the isomorphism between people, sovereign, and citizenry. And why is this? Because immigrants are typically perceived as foreigners to the community of shared loyalty towards the state and shared rights guaranteed by the state. And if you have transnational migrants, they presumably remain loyal to another state whose citizens they are and to whose sovereign they belong, as long as they are not absorbed into the national body through assimilation and through naturalization. And you see, this article was published in 2002, and it refers to the incident of 11 September 2001. And the fact that social science research has been interested in the political activity and loyalty of immigrants, a theme that Wimmer and Glickschiller argue that parallels the nation state's interest in the supervision, limitation, and control of the immigrant population. The second point they refer to is that immigrants destroy the isomorphism between people and nation. Now, what do they mean by this? So, immigrants appear as spots on the pure colors of the national fabric, reminding nationalist state builders and social scientists alike of the ethnic minorities that have been absorbed into the national body through a politics of forced assimilation and benevolent integration. Immigrants are thus represented a renewed challenge to the nation building project and point to the fragility of its achievements especially in places where the nation had never been imagined as plural and itself consisted of former immigrants. Even in immigrant societies, the major preoccupation of post-war migration studies was to measure and scrutinize the cultural differences between immigrants and nationals and to describe pathways of assimilation into the national group. In short, to deliver a description of the mechanics of a successful nation-making process. The third reason that Wimmer and Glickschiller attribute to migrants being special objects of policymaking and research are that immigrants destroy the isomorphism between people and solidarity groups. Now, what do they mean by this? You see, immigrants historically have not been meant to be a part of social security, the national community developed historically in the New Deal in the case of US, because they quote unquote come from outside into the national space of solidarity. But you can't also completely exclude them from emerging welfare systems because these are historically and institutionally tied to work processes for which immigrants are recruited. And therefore, it is due to the tension that immigrant integration into the welfare system has a touch of illegitimacy and abuse. And you know, let's take the example of Brexit, right? So when Brexit happened, when Brexit was playing out in Britain, what you clearly saw was that in the ads, the NHS, the National Health Service, was used as a means to show that, okay, the immigrants, the pressure on the National Health Service is too much because the immigrants and migrants are accessing all of these public health facilities, and therefore the natives are not able to access these, or the quality is deteriorating and so on, right? So therefore, there's always this tension between welfare, between social security, and what immigrants' relationship will be with welfare and social security. And of course, the last point here is that in general, national policies are sedentary, right? We have a sedentary bias in our, in our social science research, in our policies, and so on, right? So therefore, every move, migration is seen as the exception. Immigration is seen as an exception because it is the rule of sedentariness that is so prevalent and which is the norm of within the boundaries of the nation state, right? So therefore, cross-border movement, cross-border settlement is really seen as an exceptionality. So these are the four broad reasons that Wimmer and Glickschiller attribute to the focus, to the gaze shifting to migrants and immigration. And in all of this, you can see how methodological nationalism plays such a major role in the conceptualization, the understanding, and therefore the implications in terms of policies related to migration. So with that, I'll stop. This was just to give you a very, very, simple, brief understanding and take you through some key points in Wimmer and Glickschiller's seminal paper on methodological nationalism. As we discussed earlier, the other end of methodological nationalism is methodological individualism, right? Where you shift the gaze to the individual, just as over here the nation state attains primacy as a unit of analysis, and this has implications in theorizing, implications in policy making, implications in what we study and how we study it. The same thing is true for methodological individualism. When we shift our gaze to the individual in the method, we are focusing excessively on one unit of analysis at the cost of ignoring or at the cost of bypassing other units of analysis, such as the community, such as the household, such as the nation state. And so therefore, methodological nationalism, if it gives a lot of emphasis on agency, you're not talking about structure, you don't have the scope to talk about constraints at the structural level. So therefore, both methodological nationalism and methodological individualism can be imagined as two ends, right? Two ends of a pendulum, and good research design is something which considers both the variables and everything in between. So with that, I will stop, and for this lecture today, we use following references. The first is, of course, Andrea Wimmer and Nina Glickschiller's seminal paper, Methodological Nationalism and Beyond, Nation-State Building, Migration and the Social Sciences. This was published in Global Networks in 2002. And the second is the introductory chapter of the book, Introduction to Migration Theory, Talking Across Disciplines, by Caroline Brettel and James Holyfield. I hope you found the lecture useful. Thank you very much.